So hello everyone. Welcome to SVA, the SVA Theater. My name is Malcolm Leitner. I'm the Director of Operations for the undergraduate photography program here at the School of Visual Arts. And it's always an honor to have AIAP here on our turf. So we want to welcome you to this event. We're very excited about the panelists, and I think it's going to be, I think there'll be some wonderful discussions. And I want to go ahead and just introduce real quickly the director of AIAP, Mark Heflin, and we'll get the program started. Mark?
Thank you, Malcolm. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us for, as we call it, AIAP presents Big Talk. And we have lots of big talk in store today. So, again, thank you for being here. We hope you can stay the whole day. If you have to trickle in and out, that's fine. Feel free. We won't hold anything against you. But we're going to get going. So I'm going to bring up the first panel as I chat away, so they can carefully and slowly make their way over to the big stage. And just follow the arrows. Yep. I want to thank Stephen Fraley and SVA certainly for having us yet again in their home for this event. We really appreciate everyone's help and their support. We couldn't do it without them. So Stephen, thank you, and Malcolm, thanks for your intro. My name is Mark Heflin. I'm the director of AIAP. I know many of you, some of you I don't, so I'll get to know you over the next couple days. AIAP has a whole team of people putting everything together, and I certainly have to thank them. First off, Mauricio Ledesma, who's my colleague, who some of you will already know and will meet. He really heads up the Latin American show. Jeffrey Roberts, who's here, big thanks to him. And then our staff and our parent company, Jonathan McEwen, who puts together our AV. So we thank him as well. I just hope I know how to play it. So we're here to celebrate American photography and the new book, which maybe you got a peek at outside, and we'll certainly continue to celebrate that tomorrow night at the party, which is in a new location this year. Don't get lost, right? It's the Masonic Hall on 24th and 6th. We're celebrating American illustration and the new American illustration book. And as I'm thanking everyone, again, big thanks go to SVA for all their help, and to Epson, who sponsors the Latin American show, which you'll see tomorrow night. And we certainly could not do that without them. So big, big thanks to Epson. And Alejandro Ordonez, who is here, who some of you might have already met in the lobby. I do want to mention our newsletters, which many of you probably find in your email box every day. Dart Design Arts Daily, Pro Photo Daily, edited by David Shonauer, who's on the stage all the way to your left. And he'll be moderating this first panel. Motion Arts Pro, Dispatches from Latin America. And we have some big news coming. It's almost breaking news. We are developing 2 new email newsletters dedicated to the winners that will be starting very soon. The winners in American illustration and American photography. So watch for that. That's coming soon. So I believe that brings us to our very first panel of the day. Every day, everywhere, the Instagram-based movement. Our panel is prepared and on the stage. The names are on the screen. David, I will let you take over from here.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Last year, we did a panel here about mobile photography and its impact. And this year, we're going to look at a topic that's related in a way. The everyday, everything, or is it everyday, everywhere? I'm not quite sure. What? Everyday, everywhere. A couple of years ago, when Instagram started to be a thing, there were a lot of ideas floating around about how it was going to make photography more democratic and provide a new way for people to see the world. And to a great extent, the everyday movement is a fulfillment of those early ideas. What started as a social media feed to present an alternate view of reality of everyday life in Africa has blossomed into a global phenomenon with everyday feeds from Iran and Eastern Europe and Asia and Latin America and elsewhere, and they're growing daily. So I think the impact of this movement raises some interesting questions about the media and about the changing nature of photography and photojournalism. And we're going to talk about that today. We have our panel, and I'm actually going to introduce them, and I have some notes, so excuse me. We have Merrill Austin. Merrill is a writer whose work has appeared in Vanity. Correct me if I get any of this wrong, by the way. Austin Merrill. Austin is a writer whose work has appeared in Vanity Fair, The New Republic, Wired, and other publications. While covering Africa as a correspondent for Associated Press, he met photographer Peter DeCampo, and together they launched the Everyday Africa feed as a way to represent a reality that they were seeing that they didn't think was being represented by traditional media. We have John Edwin Mason. John is associate professor and associate chair in the Department of History at the University of Virginia, where he teaches African history and the history of photography. John has recently published articles about Margaret Bourke-White and the South African photographer George Hallett, and is currently writing a book about Gordon Parks. And he's been following the everyday feeds very closely. Stephen Mays. Many of you may already know he's worked in photography and journalism since 1987. He was the New York head of the 7 Photo Agency and secretary of the World Press Photo Competition, and is now a creative and business strategist for media professionals. And we have Michael Shaw. Michael is just what professional photographers need right now. He's a clinical psychologist. He's also the publisher and editor of the Bag News Notes blog, which analyzes media images and reports on media coverage of world events. So let's just get started. Austin, why don't you tell us about how Everyday Africa got started and how it grew and where it's going.
Sure. There was a video we were going to show. Is that?
We have that. Are you ready for that?
Should we start with that to show the whole?
That sounds great.
Yeah, let's maybe show the video first of Everyday Everywhere. So that is, I guess, kind of where we are now with the various everyday feeds in places all over the world, in the US, Iran, Africa, Latin America, Asia, and elsewhere. To step back a bit and answer your question of how this all began, Peter DeCampo is a photographer with whom I've worked on numerous occasions. I'm a writer. We were together on a trip in Western Ivory Coast in early 2012. And we were reporting on a story that was a very important story. It was a post-conflict story about how things were going in Ivory Coast after the many years of conflict that had taken place there. I had lived in Ivory Coast for 4 years. I had been a Peace Corps volunteer there in the mid-90s and then was a reporter with the Associated Press in the early 2000s. And while Peter and I were there covering this story, we found that we were doing our job, which was Peter was taking photographs of soldiers and peacekeepers and victims of war crimes and refugees, and I was interviewing those people. There's a frustration the two of us have always felt about the way that part of the world is represented. And in that moment, we felt even more frustrated because we felt like we were sort of contributing to that often media-driven stereotype. And while he was taking his photographs for the reporting that we were doing and I was doing my interviewing, we also just sort of began to take this out of our pockets and to shoot pictures as the days went by. We began to see, looking at each other's phones, that there was something to this after a while, and the images that were on our phones were actually a truer representation of life in that part of the world than the images that he was taking for the story or the interviews that I was doing. So what began as really just a couple of guys interested in life in that part of the world, taking pictures. We started a Tumblr blog. Soon thereafter, he went on an assignment to Uganda. I was on an assignment that took me to South Africa, to Nigeria, Zimbabwe. So next thing you know, we had images like this, mobile photography images from a half a dozen countries. We began speaking to other photographers who had the same kinds of frustrations with stereotypes in Africa. And they jumped on board. In September of 2012, we jumped onto Instagram, and it sort of exploded. You know, what had been, it had been difficult for us to get media interested in these kinds of images early on, and then thanks to Instagram and the sort of following that came out of that and the attention that we got through that, then the mainstream media began to come, and we got published in a number of publications. The Lens blog on the New York Times, the New Yorker's photo booth blog, National Geographic, etc. And it sort of continued to gain steam. Several months ago, we began to notice other everyday feeds. Everyday Asia was an early one, Middle East, etc. And so now what we've done is we are continuing to try to reach out to some of these folks. We had some meetings in New York a couple of months ago with about 10 or 11 of the feeds represented, and we're trying to find a way to sort of move forward together to remain independent as photographers and as small organizations, but also find ways to work together to get the stories out there, both through Instagram, through mainstream media, but also through education programming and those kinds of things. That's a compact answer to your story.
You've started a step in organizing this kind of grassroots movement.
We have. We were together during Photoville for about 10 days in September, and we had a series of meetings, and we've sort of divvied up tasks. And you know, for a long time, it was Peter and myself sort of just doing this in addition to our regular jobs. Yeah. And now we're able to sort of spread the work around a bit, and we're seeking nonprofit status, and we're trying to find a way to sort of, in a more organized way, march forward. Stephen's been there every step of the way.
Well, I'd say, rather than organize, I'd say maybe facilitate, because a lot of people have the same questions about what is this, what are we doing, how does it work, how can we do this better? You know, so it was a really interesting discussion, but it was less about suggesting to people what they should do as just exchanging experiences and recognizing differences. You know, the situation in Iran and America and Africa are all very different.
How do people get involved? I mean, how do they, if they want to ask the people in the audience how many people have seen it once, and then how many people go to an everyday site on a consistent basis? Sure. How many of you have seen one of these feeds, followed them?
So we've got some new followers to get out there.
Yeah, yeah. Those are regular followers? You go to the site consistently? Okay, well, good. We're going to bring in a new crew for you then.
And just to give you a sense, for those of you who don't know how substantial this is, Everyday Africa now has 110,000 followers. Everyday Iran has 21,000. I think Everyday USA has 35 or so. So each of these feeds have substantial followings of people.
Yeah, good. John, I want to ask you, you've been following this for probably since it was pretty early on.
Since I joined Instagram.
Yeah. What were your reactions at the beginning, and what do you think the significance of it is?
Well, I think the first thing I need to do is to say thank you to Austin, and I mean that. I teach African history as well as teaching the history of photography, and I've been teaching African history longer than I've been teaching the history of photography. I think everybody who teaches African history in the United States thinks that we spend a lot of our time unteaching what our students come into the classroom thinking that they know about Africa. And what they think they know about Africa in terms of their visual knowledge is what Austin's just been talking about. They see Africa as a continent of victims or perpetrators. They see Africa as a broken continent. They see Africa in terms of images of starving children and teenagers high on cot waving AK-47s in the air. And they can't help but see Africa in cliched and stereotyped terms because that's what they'll see if they're watching the news, or they'll see safaris and sunsets and acacia trees and that sort of thing. And the thing I like about Everyday Africa is that it really seems to strive to be everyday. It shows ordinary life. It shows the experiences that people are going through on a daily basis. And those experiences are just perfectly ordinary. And it's magical for me in the sense that it's showing life as it's lived. But of course, it also matters that it's really good photography. And those of you who are not following, you don't have to follow Everyday Africa or Everyday Iran or Everyday Jamaica because it's the right thing to do. You follow it because the photography is often really extraordinary. You saw in that video that we just saw how good it is. But my students, once they start following, and I suppose 75% of my students have an Instagram account, once they start following, what they get is a daily, sometimes hourly reminder that the Africa that they're carrying around in their heads is not the Africa that people experience on a daily basis. And so it's that daily reminder that, the cliches and the stereotypes are not entirely wrong, but they're not right either. So, yeah, it's a fantastic thing, Austin.
Thank you. It's, we do a lot of work in classrooms ourselves, and usually we got a grant to go up to the Bronx and do 8 weeks of courses with middle school students in the Bronx. And what we did there was we used Everyday Africa to introduce these kids to a better version of what life is like in that part of the world, using our photographs to talk about this part of the world and what life is really like, and to really dig into what stereotypes mean and how harmful they can be, and where photography has a real power to change that. We started with that. What we began then talking about was the stereotypes these students in the Bronx are burdened with, who live in that part of New York City. And by the end of that week, what had started as Everyday Africa had become Everyday Bronx. And we started an Everyday Bronx feed, and they were using photography to look into the ways that their communities are perceived, and how can they begin to sort of deal with that. So, one of the first things we always do in these classrooms is we start off by saying, shout out some words to me. What are the first things you think of when you think of Africa? And invariably, what people will say is, bad, war, hot, poverty, giraffe. These are what people actually say. And as discouraging as that is, it's also sort of evidence that, first of all, we're not making this up. This is a genuine problem. And secondly, we're talking to the right group of people. These are folks who have been influenced through the media in ways that really impact the way they think about that part of the world. And by the end of that hour-and-a-half first session, I'll ask them again, after looking at the photography and talking about a lot of things, can I have some more words now? And they'll see things like interesting, vibrant, varied, multifaceted, this kind of stuff. So even in just that one first session, you see this change in the way people are looking at that part of the world.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, Michael, when did you first encounter the everyday feeds?
I've been looking at the sites for at least 3 months, and what's interesting to me is how much they're gaining traction. And so, because what I'm most interested in is impact, and it's possible that this will follow a track where it will have its own closed audience, and that audience could be large, but it's not going to extend, and the meaning of everyday is not going to extend beyond that. But what I think is starting to happen already, and I think it's extremely relevant to everybody in this room, is that everyday it represents not just a paradigm shift, but also a challenge in terms of the way that American media or Western media represents issues of race, economics, and we're not just talking about abroad, but we're also talking about here. So, you know, we have a situation with this site where it's starting to challenge and confront this diet that we have every day of stereotypes, of the idea that when we feature people, they're either victims or we heroize people just for getting through their everyday life. And that's not true. That's actually bullshit. And to the extent that we look at imagery and then we get this kind of this skewed and this kind of aestheticized view of the world, we know that we're not connecting with it. So what everyday is doing, and if you're exposed to it at all, you start to see those images side by side with, like, you know, another Ebola shot, or, you know, another, you know, what looks like another famine shot, or even this week, if you want a current example, all these pictures from this from Ashura, you know, where you've got these guys whipping themselves with chains, and that's our picture of Africa. And once you start to put a picture of everyday life side by side with that, you know, when we have crisis, even the week of 9/11, you had to get up, you had to have breakfast, and then you had to worry if, like, you know, your life was going to end in 5 minutes, and then you had to talk to your friend. And what's really audacious about everyday is, and what's really political, by the way, is commonness. And this is, if we start to look at everyday and our own media side by side, and I'm hoping to God that's what happens, and the site has that kind of reach, the audacity of authenticity, if you know, is the way I think about it, then we may be talking about not just a game changer in terms of our media, but also a whole different way that you have to look at the world around you and how you're shooting it.
So, in a way, I don't know if it's quite right to say that it's subverting traditional media, but it's certainly challenging the media. And I wanted to ask Stephen, you raised a couple of really interesting points at Photoville about first that and the idea of photo feeds, of photo streams. It's a completely different way of encountering the world in terms of photojournalism, the photojournalism narrative, the classic story.
That's absolutely right. I mean, journalism traditionally has simplified the world. You know, it comes with a problem and finds a solution, and that's the purpose of an article, purpose of a series in a magazine. It's, you know, big problems, big solutions, and it's all very leveled out. And of course, the world isn't like that at all. And so those traditional forms of stories, which were, you know, very structured, beginning, middle, and end, organized information, really doesn't function on social media. What you have is this random stream of images and stories which emerge over time, and of course comments. And it's really fascinating to me how that introduction of time as an element in the telling of a story, how it spreads across, you know, days, weeks, months, and years, how that has in itself just transformed the journalism. Plus you have this shared authorship. which is, I think, huge. And that's getting away from this idea of the photographer as auteur. And it doesn't stop them from being auteurs in a different context. But it allows a much richer, rounded perception of the work. So even if you are the auteur and you post a picture online, people can still post comments. You can't stop that. Well, I think you can, actually, but...
We try not to.
So, it's really breaking that apart. I mean, to me, the big question is that, we have this I have this feeling of relative freedom, having worked in the traditional press for too many years and railed against it all the while. And I'm slightly concerned about some of the new orthodoxies which are forming. And one of them is about aesthetics. And that there's an avoidance on social media of hard, tough issues. And it's not, you're never going to force people to talk about hard, tough issues anywhere. But the general tendency on all the social media sites is to draw to the pretty, draw to the picturesque, and the easy. So while I think at this point, while we're redressing an enormously unbalanced picture, not only of Africa, but many of these other countries we're focusing on, we're in the same stroke, also maybe veering into another area.
I want to pick up on exactly that point there, and I'm happy actually that the Everyday Africa stream avoids the tough and the gritty issues. It does, and that's all right because we're getting a lot of the toughness and the grittiness elsewhere. But I'm really interested in the way that Everyday Black America is different from Everyday America or Everyday Africa, in that it is very much about addressing the everyday issues that are impinging so importantly on African Americans right now. Ferguson, police brutality, voter suppression, that sort of thing. It's a highly politicized stream. Now, I also notice it's got a very small following, but nevertheless,
it's very new. So
it's also new, but it's an indication that the everyday can reflect those issues that are critical to the photographers who are participating. I think Everyday Middle East also shares that politicized tendency.
I think one of the ways I've been thinking about this recently is that the feeds all have something in common. The Africa feed is largely about trying to debunk stereotypes, but we're not trying to say that the bad things that happen don't happen. But that's not our job, really, to tell those stories. Some of the other feeds aren't necessarily about debunking stereotypes in the same way. And so when I try to think about what do they all have in common, to me what the everyday projects have in common is that they get closer to fiction in a way of storytelling than they do journalism. A novel would not hold together if it jumped from crisis to crisis. If you went from a conflict to a coup to, a divorce to all of these various crises, the plot wouldn't hold together. You need the moments in between as fabric to sort of upon which to tell all of these stories. And so I'd like to think that the everyday feeds in a lot of ways are complementary to what you see in the press. And in the same way that a novel has to tell about what the guy did when he was on the way to the restaurant to break up with his girlfriend, and that's everything from brushing his teeth to not forgetting to feed the dog, etc., to anything under the sun, I feel like that's kind of what all the everydays are doing. They're giving those in-between moments, and those are crucial. It's not the way, as Stephen said, it's not the way journalism is done. It doesn't fit into a 700 or even a 3,000 word story, the brushing of the teeth or the feeding of the dog. But those moments on the everyday feeds in concert with what you see in the mainstream media gives you a better picture of what's going on.
Let me just bring this to just a different level. Can you explain, or maybe it's different for every feed, how it works? What is the editing process? If somebody wants to get involved, how does that happen?
They're all a little bit different. The way that Everyday Africa works is that we have a list of about 20 people who, either are from Africa or have lived there for substantial amounts of time, and so have a very deep understanding about what life is like in their part of the continent. They have the login information, and they simply post images when they're ready, and we don't sort of say, don't do this or do that. Right. A number of the other feeds work in that way as well. One of the ones that I've really been intrigued by recently is Everyday Iran. Everyday Iran is a little bit different. Instead of having a sort of a list of contributors, they have a team of people who are combing Instagram for images in Iran, and then are reposting those images. And so what the Iran feed is doing is you have a sort of a broader cross-section and a wider variety of kinds of imagery from different photographers, and they're not all necessarily professional journalists, et cetera. So they're all a little bit different. So, sometimes there'll be some curation. We'll have a special themed week. We did this a couple of years ago when Helen Habila, a Nigerian author, took photographs from 4 of our contributors who'd been working in Nigeria for a month, 2 Americans and 2 Nigerians, and then curated the images that were most interesting to him, and then we ran those images for a week. So that does happen in that sort of curatorial way from time to time, but as much as possible, we want to see it just kind of run on its own.
There was an interesting point of the discussion when you had all the contributors meeting in New York, which was what does happen if something nasty happens on your patch? And that was a really interesting discussion because it brought all these things up of, so Ebola is happening, that is a reality. Yeah. Do you ignore it? And I thought it was very smart. I mean, everyone really came to the same conclusion, which was, no, you don't ignore it, but you photograph all the ancillary life moments rather than just the body bags and the suits and all the rest of it. And so that was, I think everyone was really on a consensus with that.
I think so, and I think, and as I said, we don't want, we're not trying to pretend the bad things aren't happening, and they're important stories, but, Glenna Gordon is one of our contributors, and she's spent a lot of time covering Ebola in West Africa and Liberia and Sierra Leone, and she's posted some images for us, and you've got the sort of scary-looking picture of the guy in the medical suit, and then you also have a picture of a family at sunset making dinner, so the normal things carry on.
Well, I think the only reason that one would think, looking at this feed, that it's completely everyday or avoids bad things is because of, again, the kind of orientation that we have and is reinforced every day in the media that we consume. Because there was an image on Everyday Africa about last week that showed a woman holding a picture of her 2 sons. This was in Tunis, and the sons disappeared right after the president was deposed 2 years ago. But the thing is that we have a little bit more subtlety in it, and it's hard for us to relate to that subtlety because everything otherwise we see as sensationalized. So in a way, what is happening is it's not that everyday's avoiding difficult things, but really in this Instagram format, which is really incredible because otherwise if you go anywhere else in Instagram, it's so kind of superficial. They're actually bringing a documentary perspective to crisis or to everyday life and the tensions that are in these societies. So it's profound, but it's also subtle given what we're used to.
And if you think about the idea of stereotypes, and you brought up Everyday Black America, and there's also the Everyday USA feed, I mean, as I said earlier, they're not all the same what they're going for, but they are, when you think about stereotypes in the U.S., people frequently just think about, oh, the land of milk and honey or whatever. And so some of what the photographers are doing in the Everyday USA feed is trying to debunk that stereotype. And some of what the Everyday Black America photographers are trying to do is to shine a harder spotlight on some of the stories in that community that aren't reaching the mainstream.
Right, and the Everyday Black America is looking around the edges of the issues. They are addressing the issues, but it's looking sideways, looking backwards. It's not the hard news kind of photography. But I wanted to ask Austin and Stephen a question about this, is that I know. Michael just said something about subtlety, and I'm wondering if there's an intimacy to looking at a picture on your iPhone or your smartphone, you're holding it really close. You're not sharing it with anybody. And if you're me, you're actually taking off your glasses and you're right up on top of it. The gesture is intimate. It's very close. And does it call for a different kind of photography, or are we experiencing it differently? I'd just like to hear both of you sort of riff on the fact that it's very personal and very close when we look at these images.
I think undoubtedly, and it's interesting you pick up on that from the point of view of looking at the picture. It's certainly true in making the picture, because the phone is an incredibly intimate tool. I mean, it holds all our secrets. It's very close to us. It's also needs to be used close to other people. You can get telephoto lenses and other zoom paraphernalia, but typically it's the casualness and the intimacy which distinguishes it from the traditional camera. And that casual element is really important as well, that it's just less structured. Kevin Systrom, one of the founders of Instagram, when he was talking about the whole origin of the Instagram, it was primarily set up not as a platform, but as with the filters. You remember those filters that were so big 2 or 3 years ago? And the thinking behind that was that they could correct all the errors that people were afraid of making. And that's exactly what they did. They kind of imposed an auto-tune on the image. And what that's done is it's taken people's fear away of taking a picture. It just becomes a very casual process. No longer that totally formal, let's get the landscape straight, and it's a much more casual, therefore intimate experience.
Well, and if you think about the ways in which the gear that photojournalists bring along when they're covering a story, or the ways in which the famous, subway photographers in New York City used to try to have to conceal their equipment when they're taking a picture. This affords you a chance to be a fly on a wall in a more intimate way, I think.
Hey, David, I'm the host and also the timekeeper.
Yeah.
You have about 5 minutes if you want to.
You want to take some questions, if people have questions?
So far, this is a labor of love. When people are in these parts of the world and are doing work that I hope that they are getting compensated for, they are also doing this. It's the same way for me when I'm there. It's the same way here. I have a day job, and then I'm also trying to manage this on the side. We have been published in publications that pay from time to time. It doesn't happen all the time, but and as we go towards sort of trying to become a sustainable nonprofit, it will be about grant writing.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I wanted to bring up. On a practical level, it is one avenue for people to get their pictures seen by photo editors.
And there have been contributors on Everyday Africa and all the Everyday feeds who I think have found themselves in front of editors in ways that they were not before.
Yeah.
For me, I think it's actually going the other way, and it's really important to realize one other kind of paradigmatic possibility out of this also, which is that you can have a complete democratic media. And if you look at all the sites run a little differently. The one that's unique is Everyday Iran. As Austin was saying, it's completely curated, and the images are all crowdsourced. So what does that mean? That means that all of the imagery is coming from you and me. Anybody who puts a hashtag onto Instagram with Everyday Iran can be the person who's featured that day. So if you think about taking that model into the United States, I think right now you have Everyday Bronx and you have Everyday, there's a New Jersey site also, but if you start to take that into different cities, and with people that are only curating, then all of a sudden, all of us are potential contributors. And then the content becomes the content that's most salient. It's not who you know. It's not, that, the whole system that we have right now starts to flatten out. And I think the potential for that, even if some of you go out and start to create some of these, everyday sites that are more locally based and not, based on a continent or state, I think the upside's potential for a purely democratic media. So I think it actually I think it's going to challenge traditional media, but I really pray and hope that it makes its own.
And this gets back to your question from earlier about how do you get involved. I mean, one of the ways to get involved is to create your own everyday site. We don't own every day. I don't feel like there's a way you could own that. So a lot of these everydays you see out there were started by people that we are not connected with at all.
And it seems to me that you can see a progress where it's the everyday can get more and more localized and localized and localized.
And not just geographically. You've also got Everyday Black America is an example. Another one that started recently is Everyday Incarceration, which has been a really it's brand new, but they're doing some interesting work in trying to find ways through photography to talk about the prison system in this country. As I was saying before, for Everyday Africa, we just hand out the login information and people log on and post the images. They just go. And that's the way most of the sites work. Everyday Incarceration was begun by some folks at CUNY, along with Pete Brook, who's out in the Bay Area. And it's brand new, but they are trying to get together some photographers who have done important work in the prison system and find ways to tell stories that are not necessarily stories of someone in prison, but the impact that has on families and communities and so forth. It's brand new.
Peter, aren't photographers getting assignments, Everyday Africa photographers, because of the exposure that they are getting on Everyday Africa?
Yeah, there are people who have gotten work out of this, who weren't known to certain photo editors before, and now are, and have gotten assignments that way. Sure. The money question is one that we're wrestling with all the time and trying to figure out. When we have written grants in the past for some of this education work, the money came in, and then the money went out to the folks who were organizing the various aspects of this. And at the end of the day, it was still volunteer work for me and for Peter. So I don't have a good answer to that question. I know that it's a burning question for everyone in this room and everyone in the industry, not just for photographers, but for reporters and everyone in journalism. We're trying to figure that out as well.
Well, Instagram did spend about maybe a couple $100,000 to bring these people that are doing Instagram around the world over to New York and the Photoville Festival a couple weeks ago. So
probably
I
wasn't
think
a couple
there must be a pony
$100,000
in there somewhere,
It wasn't a couple $100,000. It was just enough to bring a few people here. But
well,
yeah.
but they had a two-story. Well, in terms of I'm glad you correct me on that. But they did bring people from around the world that are doing these sites, and they had a two-story booth, and they, and a lot of promotion around it. So again, I think there's a pony in there.
Most of the feeds, if you go to the Instagram page, there will be either a website link there in the bio or an email address that you can write to someone. They're not all that way, but many of them are like that. Honestly, it's just something that sort of people who are like-minded have gotten together and have just started. We get emails all the time from people who are traveling to that part of the world and are not able to let everyone have the login information. It would just simply crash. We are currently in the process of trying to grow our list of contributors. Every feed's a little bit different. And it's, as I said earlier, this is something that everyone's doing as a labor of love. It's not like it's a business or something. So one of the ways that we're trying to give exposure to other people is that on Fridays, for our Follow Friday, anyone who has hashtagged their image Everyday Africa, that work will be seen, and we try to feature someone's work who's not a contributor on Fridays in that way. The Everyday Everywhere feed is a way of looking at all the images across all of the everyday feeds and anyone else who's out there taking pictures on the street on 23rd Street out here or wherever they are and have hashtagged their pictures Everyday Everywhere. We see those photographs, and that's how we are trying to populate the Everyday Everywhere feed. So those are ways that we're able to pull people in also.
David, I think we have to end here.
All right.
I'm afraid we have to end.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, but thank this panel.